I still remember the smell of the sea that morning, salt and diesel, mixed with the sour taste of fear. It's been more than 80 years now, but that day remains as clear in my mind as if it were yesterday. My name is David Miller, Private First Class, 83rd Infantry Division, United States Army. I was 20 years old when I stepped off that landing craft and into the greatest storm the world had ever known. I wasn't a hero. I was a farm boy from Ohio. Before the war, I had never traveled farther than the county line. My hands knew the weight of a plow, not a rifle. But history doesn't ask if you're ready. It sweeps you into its current and expects you to swim. They shipped us across the Atlantic in early June 1944. We were packed into the belly of a transport ship like sardines, sleeping in bunks stacked 4 high. The ocean was rough, and more than one man spent his nights hanging over the rail, feeding the fish. I wasn't seasick, not physically at least. But inside, my stomach was in knots. We all knew what was waiting for us on the other side. France, Hitler's fortress Europe, and thousands of German guns pointed straight at us. At night, I would lie awake and listen to the engines hum beneath my feet. I'd picture my mother back home, hanging laundry on the line, or my little sister running through the cornfields. It felt like another life, one I wasn't sure I'd ever return to. We landed in England first. The countryside was green and peaceful, nothing like the battlefield we'd imagined. We trained there for weeks, running drills, practicing assaults, crawling under barbed wire while machine guns fired live rounds over our heads. But no matter how hard they pushed us, we all knew the same truth. Nothing could prepare a man for real combat. When the orders came, they came suddenly. We boarded ships under the cover of darkness, our packs heavy on our shoulders and our rifles clutched tight. The invasion had already begun. The beaches of Normandy were soaked in blood, and now it was our turn to join the fight. We hit the shore in late June, a few weeks after D-Day. Even then, the beaches were a graveyard, wrecked landing craft, burned-out tanks, the twisted bodies of men who had never made it past the sand. The smell was something I'll never forget, salt and smoke and death. They told us our job was simple: push inland, link up with other divisions, and drive the enemy out of Normandy. Simple words, impossible task. The first time I heard a bullet snap past my ear, I froze. It wasn't like in the movies, no dramatic music, no slow motion. Just a sharp, terrifying crack, and a man beside me dropped like a sack of grain. Training kicked in. We dove into the dirt and started returning fire. Somewhere in the chaos, I realized I was no longer afraid. There was no room for fear, only survival. They called it the bocage, a maze of hedgerows and sunken lanes that turned every field into a fortress. The Germans knew the terrain better than we did, and they used it to deadly effect. Every step forward was ambush, counterattack, blood. We learned quickly. We moved in small squads, flanking machine gun nests, tossing grenades over hedgerows, clearing one field at a time. We advanced maybe a mile a day and paid for each one with lives. My squad leader, Sergeant Thompson, used to say, "Don't think about the whole war, just think about the next 10 feet. 10 feet. That was our world. A ditch here, a stone wall there. And always the crack of rifles and the distant thump of artillery. One evening, after a particularly brutal firefight, I sat in a muddy ditch and watched the sunset paint the sky red. I remember thinking how strange it was that beauty could still exist in a place so ugly. That thought kept me human. By early July, we were veterans, or at least we felt like it. The faces around me had changed. Some were gone, replaced by fresh recruits. Others were the same but different, opening, older somehow, their eyes harder, their laughter quieter. The fighting near Carentan was some of the worst I've ever seen. The Germans weren't just soldiers, they were ghosts. They appeared and vanished like smoke, hitting us from behind hedges, barns, even church steeples. We lost good men for inches of ground. But we adapted. We always adapted. That was the difference between living and dying. It was there, crawling through mud and blood, that I stopped being the boy who left Ohio. I became something else, a soldier. And whether I liked it or not, That was who I had to be. Our next objective was the port city of Saint-Malo, a fortress the Germans swore would never fall. They had dug in deep, bunkers, artillery, machine guns hidden in stone walls, centuries old. It was a city built for siege, and we were the storm battering at its gates. The assault began on a grey morning in early August. Artillery shook the earth for hours before we moved in. The streets were a maze of rubble and fire. Every corner could be death. We fought house by house, room by room. Some days, we advanced only a few yards. I remember one street in particular, Rue de Dinan. A sniper had us pinned for hours. We couldn't move without someone getting shot. Finally, we crawled through the basement of a collapsed bakery, came up behind him and ended it. That's how it was. Dirty, desperate, improvised. When Saint-Malo finally fell after 2 weeks of relentless fighting, we were too exhausted to celebrate. The port was in ruins, the enemy surrendered or dead. But the road was open. The breakout from Normandy had begun. We didn't stop. We couldn't. Orders came to push deeper into France, cutting off German retreat routes and seizing towns before they could regroup. We moved like a tide, sweeping across the countryside, through villages that cheered us and others that stood silent, shattered by years of occupation. Somewhere near the Loire River, I realized I no longer marked time by days or dates. Life had become a series of battles and brief pauses in between. Sleep was rare, food was rationed, friends disappeared overnight. Yet despite everything, we kept going. Because that's what soldiers do. They keep going, no matter how heavy the burden, no matter how deep the scars. The further we pushed into France, the harder the fighting became. The Germans were retreating, yes, but they were not broken. Every bridge we reached, they blew. Every town we approached, they turned into a fortress. They were buying time, hoping to regroup somewhere deeper inside their crumbling empire. And it was our job to make sure they never got that chance. Our orders were to seize crossings over the Loire River. The river stretched wide and calm before us, but it was no friend. On the far bank, the enemy had dug in. They had machine guns, mortars, and artillery waiting to tear us apart the moment we stepped into the water. We waited until nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, our engineers began building pontoon bridges. We crossed in silence, the only sounds the soft splash of oars and the creak of the boats. Halfway across, the sky exploded. German flares turned night into day, and machine guns ripped into the water around us. Men screamed and fell overboard. Boats capsized. Still, we rowed. My hands shook as I gripped the paddle, praying we'd make it to the other side before the river swallowed us whole. When we finally reached the far bank, soaked and breathless, we scrambled up the muddy slope and opened fire. The fighting lasted 3 days. We clawed our way forward yard by yard, clearing trenches, destroying bunkers, refusing to give an inch back. By the end, the Loire was ours. The enemy had been driven back once again, and the road to Germany was a little shorter. By October, we had left the sunny fields of France behind. Ahead of us loomed a dark, endless wall of pine trees, the Hedgerow forest. On the map, it looked like just another obstacle. On the ground, it was hell itself. The trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun. The ground was soft and wet, sucking at our boots with every step. We couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. The Germans were everywhere, hidden in bunkers, buried in foxholes, perched in treetops. Mines lined the trails. Barbed wire cut through the underbrush. Artillery shells exploded in the branches above, showering us with splinters of wood and steel. Every day was a nightmare. We moved cautiously, slowly, because rushing meant dying. We lost men to traps, to snipers, to invisible enemies who vanished as quickly as they appeared. Progress was measured not in miles but in feet. A single ridge could take days to capture. At night, I would lie awake in my foxhole, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Sometimes it sounded like the voices of the men we had lost. Sometimes I wondered if we would ever get out of that cursed forest alive. Weeks passed. The cold set in. Food grew scarce. Our clothes were soaked and stiff with mud, but still we pressed on. The Germans were determined to hold the forest, but we were just as determined to take it. Inch by inch we did. December came, and with it snow. We were tired, more tired than I'd ever thought possible, but we believed the war was nearly over. We were deep inside enemy territory. The Reich was crumbling. Victory felt close enough to taste. Then, without warning, the world turned upside down. Before dawn on December 16th, the German army launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes. Tanks, infantry, artillery, everything they had left, smashed into our lines. Entire divisions were thrown into chaos. It was Hitler's last gamble, and it very nearly worked. We were rushed north to plug the holes in the front. The snow was waist-deep, the cold unbearable. Our breath froze in our helmets. Our rifles jammed. Frostbite ate at our fingers and toes, and the enemy came, wave after wave, screaming from the woods. We fought in small towns and frozen fields. We fought from basements and barns, from trenches carved out of ice. There was no rest, no warmth, no escape. Just fighting, brutal, relentless fighting. I saw things in those weeks I will never forget. Tanks burning in the snow, men frozen where they fell, trees splintered by artillery fire. We held on because we had no other choice, and slowly, inch by inch, the German offensive ground to a halt. By January, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The enemy had thrown everything they had at us, and failed. They would never again have the strength to launch an attack on that scale. The tide of war had turned for good. With the Ardennes behind us, there was only one major obstacle left, the Rhine River. Beyond it lay the heart of Germany. If we could cross it, the road to Berlin would be wide open. The Rhine was wide, fast and deadly. The Germans had blown most of the bridges and fortified the far bank with artillery and machine guns. Crossing it would be one of the most dangerous missions of the war. We moved at night. The engineers built rafts and makeshift bridges while we waited in silence, listening to the distant rumble of enemy guns. When the signal came, we stepped into the boats and began to row. The river was alive with fire. Tracers lit up the night sky. Mortar shells splashed into the water around us. Men died before they even touched the shore. But we kept going. We had come too far to turn back now. When we reached the far side, we fought like demons. There was no time for fear, no room for hesitation. We stormed the trenches, cleared the bunkers, pushed the enemy back step by step. By dawn, we had a bridgehead. By nightfall, the Rhine was ours. The last weeks of the war were a blur. We advanced faster than ever, capturing towns and cities almost daily. German resistance was crumbling. Entire units surrendered without a fight. Civilians lined the roads, waving white flags and offering bread and water. Some were relieved to see us. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, as the world they had known collapsed around them. We were different too, harder, colder. We had seen too much to feel joy, too much to celebrate. Victory was close, but it felt distant, like something that belonged to someone else. One morning in April, we entered a small town near Magdeburg. The fighting there was brief. Most of the enemy had already fled or surrendered. But what we found on the outskirts of that town would stay with me for the rest of my life. It was a camp, rows of barbed wire and wooden barracks, filled with people who looked more like shadows than human beings. They were starving, skeletal, their eyes too big for their faces. Many were too weak to stand. Some were already dead. I had seen death before. I had seen men torn apart by bullets and bombs. But nothing prepared me for that. This was not war. This was something far worse. It was evil, pure and deliberate. We gave them what food we had. We radioed for medics and supplies. But for many it was too late. They had survived years of unimaginable suffering, only to die days, sometimes hours, before liberation. It was there, in that place, that I understood why we were fighting. Not for glory, not for medals, but for them, for people who could not fight for themselves. On May 8, 1945, word came down the line. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. We didn't cheer, we didn't shout. We just stood there in stunned silence, trying to process the meaning of those words. For months we had lived with death as our constant companion. Now, suddenly, it was over. Some men cried, others laughed. I just sat down on the ground and stared at the sky. I thought about home, about the farm, the fields, the people I had left behind, and I thought about the men who would never make it back. We had started as strangers. Over time we had become brothers, and now too many of those brothers were gone. When the guns finally fell silent, the silence was almost unbearable. For months, every waking moment had been filled with the noise of war, the rattle of machine guns, the thunder of artillery, the shouts of men. Now there was nothing but the wind and the soft creak of our gear as we stood, unsure of what to do next. The war was over. We had survived. But survival is not the same as peace. Our division was assigned to occupation duty. The enemy we had fought so fiercely just days before was now under our guard. German soldiers, once so fearsome, shuffled past us with blank faces, their rifles piled in heaps. Civilians emerged from hiding, pale, thin, exhausted. The proud Reich that had once boasted of a 1,000-year empire lay in ruins. We patrolled the streets of shattered cities, where buildings were nothing but skeletons of stone. We stood watch over bridges that spanned rivers filled with debris. We delivered food to families who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. I had imagined that victory would feel different, that there would be parades, music, celebration. Instead, it felt hollow. There was too much death, too much suffering, too many memories that refused to fade. We had won, yes, but the cost of that victory was written in blood across an entire continent. I often found myself wandering away from the unit during our patrols. I'd walk through the rubble, past the burned-out shells of buildings, and wonder who had lived there, what their lives had been like before the war. I thought about the people we had liberated, the ones in the camps, the ones hiding in basements, and I wondered if they would ever truly heal. The weeks after Germany's surrender were strange. We were soldiers without a war. Some of us guarded prisoners of war. Others escorted refugees back to their homes. A few were assigned to protect key facilities from looting and sabotage. I was part of a team sent to search abandoned German headquarters for documents. Most of it was routine. Maps, orders, old files. But sometimes we found things that chilled us. Reports from concentration camps. Photographs of atrocities. Lists of names, millions of them. Evidence of a cruelty so vast and deliberate, it felt beyond comprehension. I realized then that the fight had never truly been about land or borders. It had been about stopping this machine built to erase entire peoples, to turn human lives into numbers on a page. And in that realization, I found a measure of peace. Whatever doubts I'd had about the war, they vanished. We had done what needed to be done. In the autumn of 1945, our orders finally came. We were going home. The trip back across the Atlantic was quieter than the one that had brought us to Europe. There was laughter, yes, songs, card games, talk of the future. But beneath it all was a heaviness none of us could shake. We had survived, but not all of us had. Too many friends were buried far from home, their names carved into white crosses and stars, scattered across Europe. I stood on the deck one evening, watching the sun sink into the ocean. It was beautiful, the kind of sunset that would have made me smile before the war. But now, it only made me think of those who would never see it. When we finally reached New York Harbor, the skyline rose on the horizon like a dream. Crowds waited on the docks, waving flags and cheering. Bands played. Families held signs. But even as we marched down the gangplank, part of me felt distant, as if I were watching it all from outside myself. Home wasn't the same anymore, and neither was I. Returning to civilian life was harder than I expected. The farm was still there. My family was still there. The rhythms of life, planting, harvesting, Sunday dinners, hadn't changed. But I had. The first few weeks were the hardest. I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, certain I'd heard artillery. Loud noises made me flinch. Crowds made me uneasy. I avoided conversations about the war, not because I didn't want to talk about it, but because I couldn't find the words. People would ask, "What was it like?" I never knew how to answer. How do you explain months of fear, exhaustion, and grief to someone who's never felt it? How do you describe the weight of watching friends die, or the emptiness of walking through a town that no longer exists? I learned to keep most of it inside. Instead, I focused on small things, the feel of soil between my fingers, the sound of rain on the barn roof, the taste of fresh bread. Life's simple pleasures felt deeper now, more precious. Maybe that was one gift the war had given me, an understanding of how fragile everything truly is. Slowly, the nightmares faded. The jumpiness lessened. I learned to live again. I married a girl from my hometown, someone I'd known before the war but never really noticed. We built a life together. We had children, then grandchildren. I worked the farm. I joined the local veterans group. On Memorial Day, I marched in parades and laid flowers at the monument downtown. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I would sit on the porch and tell my children stories. Not about the horrors of war, but about the men I had served with. About their courage, their humor, their loyalty. I wanted my kids to know that, beneath the uniforms and the rifles, we were just ordinary people who had been asked to do extraordinary things. Every once in a while, I'd receive a letter from one of the men in my old unit. Most of us had scattered across the country after the war, building lives in different towns and states, but those bonds forged in the fire never truly broke. When we met at reunions, it was as if no time had passed at all. We laughed, we cried, we remembered. And when one of us passed on, we mourned him as a brother. Even now, all these years later, the war is never far from my mind. Sometimes I see it in my dreams, the beaches of Normandy, the hedgerows of France, the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Sometimes it's the faces of the men I lost, boys who should have grown old but never did. There are moments when the memories hit me out of nowhere. A crack of thunder that sounds like artillery, the smell of diesel that takes me back to the landing craft, the sight of barbed wire on a fence that reminds me of the camps. I used to think I'd leave the war behind someday. Now I know better. The war lives in me, not as a wound, but as a part of who I am. It shaped me. It taught me about fear and courage, about hate and compassion, about how far a man can go when he has no choice but to keep moving forward. If there's one thing I've learned from it all, it's this. Freedom is fragile. It's easy to take for granted until it's gone. But once you've seen what happens when tyranny takes hold, once you've walked through the ruins of cities and the gates of camps, you understand that it must be protected, no matter the cost. I've also learned that war is not glory. It's not flags waving or trumpets sounding. It's mud and blood and sleepless nights. It's fear and loss and sacrifice. And yet, within all that darkness, there's something profound. The strength of the human spirit, the will to endure, the unbreakable bonds between those who stand together. I don't glorify what we did, but I don't regret it either. We stopped something terrible. We gave millions a chance to live free, and though the price was high, it was worth paying. Now, as I sit here in the twilight of my life, I often wonder how history will remember us. Will they know what it cost? Will they understand the weight of what we carried? Or will they reduce it to dates and numbers in a textbook? I hope they remember the people, the young men who left their homes and dreams behind to fight in faraway lands. I hope they remember the courage, the sacrifice, the quiet acts of kindness that shone through even in the darkest moments. Most of all, I hope they remember the lesson we learned the hard way, that evil doesn't disappear on its own. It must be confronted. It must be stopped. And if my story, if our story, helps even one person understand that, then everything we endured will have meant something. I am old now. My hair is white. My hands are unsteady. The world I fought for has changed in ways I could never have imagined. But every now and then, when the sky darkens and a storm rolls in, I hear the distant rumble of thunder, and I remember. I remember the beaches and the forests, the fear and the hope, the brothers I lost and the ones who made it home. I remember the cold mornings and the endless marches, the nights spent staring at the stars and wondering if I'd live to see another dawn. And in that thunder, I hear the echo of who we were. Young men who stood against the darkness and refused to yield. Ordinary soldiers who changed the course of history. We were the thunder that rolled across a broken world, and though the storm has passed, its echoes will never fade.